It was not quite the 75th birthday party NATO had planned. On paper, NATO arrived in Washington, D.C. with much to celebrate. The mightiest military alliance ever wielded is mightier than ever, 32 members strong since the admission of Sweden earlier this year. Since February 2022, NATO has acquired, if for the most wretched and tragic reasons, a renewed sense of purpose, and it has been of vital assistance as its ally and prospective member Ukraine has resisted Russia's onslaught. Events, however, were rather overshadowed by the domestic political travails of the summit's host, US President Joe Biden, a man 6 years older than NATO and in significantly less vigorous health. This special episode of The Foreign Desk was recorded at the 2024 NATO summit in Washington, D.C. That is authentic summit hubbub you can hear in the background. How far has NATO come in its first 75 years? How well is the alliance responding to the challenge on its eastern flank? And what are NATO's future prospects, especially if the citizens of its most powerful member nation re-elect this November a man whose interest in and understanding of NATO cannot necessarily be taken for granted? This is The Foreign Desk.
I sort of made it my rather thankless task at the time to cover the enlargement of the EU and NATO, because I thought, when it happens, this is going to change the face of Europe and change the lives of so many people across the continent and across the world. It was very emotional, having covered all the negotiations, to see the flags being raised outside NATO headquarters in Brussels. Foreign ministers watching those flags go up were crying, and I think many of us were as well.
If this summit doesn't yield kind of a clear path to Ukrainian victory, it'll probably reinforce President Trump's disdain for Ukraine. It'll probably reinforce his perceptions of the Europeans as kind of feckless and weak, unwilling to kind of stand up for their own defense, their own backyard. It'll further reinforce his negative perceptions of NATO.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller. We will hear first of all from Ian Bremmer, political scientist and president of the Eurasia Group, who had this to say about how the question of Joe Biden's health had taken over the NATO summit and whether it mattered for the projection of American authority that the president was showing every one of his 81 years.
I don't know that it would matter that much if we didn't have an election in 4 months. So if the election were in 4 years and he was looking this old, people would be paying a lot more attention to Kamala, they'd be paying a lot more attention to the cabinet. I think the issue is so urgent and is driving the beginning of every conversation with every head of state I've had since I've gotten here, is because they worry that Biden is going to be forced to step down, and irrespective that he's likely to lose, that Trump's likely to be the next president. That is why this is a crisis. Now, I do agree that Biden's age and the fact that he has slowed dramatically over the course of this presidency does make him a little less likely to take strong, confident decisions. So, for example, on Israel-Palestine, I do think that some of the advice that he's gotten from his team around you need to be stronger and sharper and faster in going after Netanyahu, who is undermining his own country's democracy and is isolating his country on the global stage. You need to be out there. You need to create a coalition with allies on that. I think that Biden was more willing to let the situation evolve, kick the can down the road, than he would have been 5 years ago. So I think it matters. But I wouldn't frame it in as dramatic and dire a fashion as you had were it not for the November elections.
What do you think is the most plausible way forward for the Democrats at the moment, then, if they actually want to win in November? Should Biden go now? Should he announce that he will complete the term and let the party figure out another nominee?
It's the hardest question there is. It's a very big bet, and I don't mind taking big bets, but I like making them when I have good information. And right now you're asking to make a big bet when you don't have good information. What I will tell you is I have not met a single leader inside the United States that believes that Biden is fit to serve another 4 years. And furthermore, I do not believe that he has the team around him that is capable of adequately responding to this crisis in a way that will right and stabilize the boat. I think Biden has been a good president, and if he was fit to lead for another 4 years, I would want him to stay. But I don't believe that. And so given that, I think it would be appropriate as soon as the NATO summit is over in the coming days to week for Biden to stand aside and allow Kamala Harris to become the presidential candidate. I think that's the right decision. But I want to be very, very clear. There are no good decisions to be made in this environment. Anything you're doing risks a very, very disastrous outcome for the people that are hoping that Trump will not come back into power.
That was Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. If the career of one NATO official has demonstrated NATO's evolution since the Cold War ended, it might be that of its long-serving former chief spokesperson, Oana Lungescu, raised on the other side of the Iron Curtain in Romania. She stepped down from her post in September 2023, and this was the first summit she attended in a non-official capacity, but nonetheless as a guest of outgoing Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg for the anniversary celebrations. I began by asking her whether the last few summits, those since February 2022, had a noticeably different tone compared to the ones she'd attended before that. Please excuse the inescapable DC summit soundtrack of hotel lobby music and police sirens.
It's my first summit as not the NATO spokesperson and not a BBC journalist. So I have been involved in some way or another with NATO summits over 30 years now. So this is the 20th NATO summit that I am somehow part of, because I was invited by the Secretary General to the anniversary celebrations, and that was an important moment, an emotional moment, but I don't have any official role.
I mean, have the last few summits, by which I mean since February 2022, had a noticeably different tone when you compare them to the ones you attended before that?
I think the tone actually changed since 2014. With the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia. And if I go back even further in time, my first summit as NATO spokesperson was the Lisbon summit in 2010, when the previous strategic concept of NATO was approved, where NATO described Russia as a strategic partner.
Those were the days.
Those were the days. And as he was then President Medvedev, took part in the summit and the NATO-Russia Council. And I remember negotiating with his team the fact that Medvedev could not brief the media on the outcome of the summit before the Secretary General and President Obama, which came as something of a surprise to them. But yes, those were the days. In the meantime, of course, at the Madrid summit in 22, after Russia's illegal invasion, full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, NATO adopted the new strategic concept where Russia is described as the most direct threat to the alliance. And to go beyond that, China is also described as a challenge to our security interests and values. So it really shows how the geostrategic landscape has fundamentally changed.
I mean, I suppose it changed most obviously fundamentally that night in February 2022, and it was weird enough trying to make sense of that as a journalist. Is this going to happen or is this not going to happen? Inside NATO itself, what's your recollection of that? Did people still think up until the last minute maybe he's bluffing, or was it sort of days and weeks ahead people were starting to think this is going to get real?
Yes, we started getting the intelligence briefings in November 21, and I remember being in one of those early briefings where the briefer explained that the aim was for Russia to take Kiev and to decapitate the Ukrainian government. And it really felt like a punch in the gut, because nobody would have expected it to happen on such a huge scale and to be planned in such a way. And actually, starting in November 21, NATO started declassifying an unprecedented amount of intelligence, which we used in our communications to warn our publics about what we expected to happen, about Russia's massive military buildup on the border with Ukraine, about the sorts of capabilities that they were bringing, and the fact that this was not just a mere exercise, as the Kremlin claimed. So by the time we got to the 24th of February 22, we basically knew it was going to happen around 4 o'clock in the morning. We thought it could happen a few days before. The weather wasn't good for the Russians, so it happened when it did. And then NATO was actually prepared. When we went in very early that morning, it only took a couple of hours for the ambassadors of NATO allies to agree to activate the defense plans which we had on the shelves, and that meant that the readiness of our troops from the Baltic to the Black Sea was significantly raised, and there were more capabilities and thousands of troops coming under the command of NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe General Cavoli. So that was not a surprise. People were obviously very shocked, but we were prepared.
But in your role in particular, in, I guess, communicating NATO's response, did you have a preordained plan in place? Had you started thinking about this is what we'll say and this is how we will say it?
We took this deliberate decision to use intelligence in a way in which NATO had never done before, and in which NATO allies had never done before.
Was there a lot of argument about that within NATO? Because there is, I think, a reflexive thing among defence and intelligence types not to tell anybody any more than they really have to.
You're absolutely right. And, our usual line on that was, we don't comment on intelligence. So until then, yes, we were very careful about the extent to which we would go into intelligence. Because, of course, intelligence can be fallible. And we knew the public skepticism about intelligence. So we had to be very sure about the intelligence that we had. This was joint intelligence, so it didn't come from just one source. It came from multiple serious allied sources, and we had a relationship of trust built over several years with our intelligence community, because this is not an easy relationship between the intelligence community, who usually don't want to disclose too much, obviously, and the communicators who are trying to make the case why it's important to actually explain why we have to do what we're doing. So we were able to build that rapport and to decide together that we would be declassifying intelligence specifically to be used in our public communications, so that we could make the case to our audiences who was the aggressor and who was the victim of aggression, to avoid the sort of confusion that we saw back in 2014 over Crimea, and to help build up support for the type of decisions that NATO would have to take, both to strengthen our own defenses, but also to support Ukraine in its hour of need.
The 75th anniversary summit, as this is obviously going to be prompting an amount of reflection on NATO's journey to this point. And I did want to ask you about that, because you have an extraordinary, unusual perspective on NATO. And of course, you were raised in circumstances, i.e. Ceausescu's Romania, where I guess if you thought of NATO at all, you were raised to think of it as the enemy.
Absolutely. NATO was the enemy, and that's what we were taught in schools. And, we would do exercises in school, hiding under the desk in case the US detonated a neutron bomb. Of course, absurd, but
and
that
probably
was the mindset.
While you're hiding under those desks, you're probably not thinking, one day I will be the principal spokesperson of this organisation.
No, absolutely unimaginable. It was, I come from a different world, if you want. I come from a different planet, even. Back in those days when I was growing up in communist Romania, as a teenager, I would hide under the bed covers and listen to foreign radio stations, the BBC World Service, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Deutsche Welle, and that opened a window on the outside world. But I was doing it under the bed covers because, of course, we're all afraid that the neighbors would hear us and report us to the secret police, the dreaded Securitate.
It's a thing that's come up a lot in our conversations with people over the last couple of years, in particular, the way that NATO is it's seen differently, I don't want to say taken less for granted by people from those countries that used to be, to one level or another, hostages of the Soviet Union, but it must have been, I'm assuming, quite a spectacular moment for you when Romania joined in 2007.
Yes, I was working for the BBC as a correspondent, and actually when the BBC sent me to Brussels back in 1997, they said, have a look and see what stories we're not covering. And within a few weeks I said, well, we're not covering the enlargement of NATO and the enlargement of the European Union, because they weren't really on the mental radar at that time. And of course, these were long, complicated processes. And obviously, in the media, we don't like process, So I sort of made it my rather thankless task at the time to cover these processes, the enlargement of the EU and NATO, because I thought, wow, when it happens, I knew it was an issue of when, not if. This is going to change the face of Europe and change the lives of so many people across the continent and across the world. So yeah, it was very emotional, having covered all the negotiations with all the former communist countries, both for the EU and NATO, to see the flags, first of Poland, the Czech Republic and Hungary, being raised outside NATO headquarters in Brussels, and then of the other former communist countries, including Romania, the Baltic countries. And people were crying. Foreign ministers watching those flags go up were crying, and I think many of us were as well.
That was Oana Lungescu, former principal spokesperson of NATO. This is the Foreign Desk. You're listening to the Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. It has been noticeable since February 2022 that the importance placed on NATO membership by individual countries is inversely proportional to their distance from Russia. The closer they are, the greater their gratitude for the alliance. We'll hear now from three ministers from countries for whom Russia is not a theoretical threat. First, Hanno Pevkur, Defence Minister of Estonia, celebrating not just NATO's 75th anniversary, but also the 20th anniversary of Estonia's membership. I began by asking him whether he believes that some of the older members occasionally take NATO for granted.
Well, I have the sense that we have the same rights and we are a member of the club. And I have the sense that now NATO is stronger than ever, when we have also Sweden and Finland as part of the club. Now it's good that, Finland and Sweden are the youngest members. But, being 20 years in the club, so it was a bit funny to hear sometimes that, it's still the youngest member of the club.
You've spoken a few times over the last few weeks and indeed over the last couple of years about the threshold of 2% of GDP spending on defence. You don't think it's enough. Where do you think it should be hovering?
Well, yes, I do believe that it's not enough because we see what Russia is doing. So they are pushing already close to 9% from their annual budget. So it's a huge number what Russia is doing at the moment. And still the only threat can come from the east. So we do not see any threat from south, north or west. And that means that we have to cope with that. And we have to be ready to send a message to Russia that don't even think. Because the only thing Russia understands is the power. So we've said that many times and nothing has changed. So looking also into the Cold War era in the early 80s, so when the NATO members put around 3.7 to 4%, even more than 4%, many of NATO countries into defense, and that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we dropped to 1%. This was a mistake, and we have to acknowledge and we have to say very clearly that this was a mistake. There was a hope in the West that Russia will be a democratic country. This hope was a false, let's say, perception. And now we have to clean up the mess, and we have to be very clear that for at least a decade, even more, we have to be on the 2.5-3% level to clear up that mess and to be ready to be in the position where Russia clearly sees that, there is no position even to think about threatening or, tackling the European Union or NATO.
The refrain that we keep hearing from Ukrainians, which you've echoed yourself more than once, is that they're getting enough material to carry on fighting, but not actually enough to win, and therefore obviate the need for any more fighting. Do you think NATO is getting anywhere towards a point where it just says, look, whatever it takes, we'll do it?
Well, of course, NATO as an alliance has always said that it's the decision of the countries. So NATO as an organization will not take this decision. For me, it has always been the question that are the Rammstein coalition members ready to make a decision that, okay, let's win this war and let's send everything Ukraine needs. And that means first, technological superiority, secondly, airspace control or the air superiority. And then you can start, also with the fighter jets, with the long-range fires. And you have to exclude all these restrictions for the weapon systems because, you cannot fight with one hand behind your back. So this is why I see a clear determination of countries to help Ukraine to get the victory. And of course, it is also important that Russia will lose that war, that they will not have the anticipation that they got some victory from that. Although it doesn't matter how this war ends for Putin, of course, and for Russian domestic audience, still it will be a victory, whatever the result will be. Even when they will be kicked out from the Ukrainian territory, then probably Putin will say that we achieved our result of denazification of Ukraine. But this is totally different story. What is the reality? What is the message inside of Russia?
That was Estonian Defence Minister Hanno Pevkur. Next, Baiba Brace, Latvia's Foreign Minister and NATO's former Assistant Secretary-General for Public Diplomacy. I began by asking her how different it is to arrive at a NATO summit as a politician rather than as a NATO official.
It's very different, actually, because, of course, at NATO, I worked for Jens, so we did everything to prepare the summit from the inside, from NATO perspective. And that involved working with the allies to increase the united message that we try to get out. What are the main deliverables of the summit? And as a foreign minister, of course, I represent my country. So, for me, I don't work for 32 allies anymore. I work for one ally, which is me. And there it's sort of more straightforward in that respect that, President is the head of delegation in our case, so we prepare. So what are the main issues with regard to deterrence defense, right? You evaluate the overall threat. You work with the military, NATO military among the 32 allies, in terms of understanding, okay, there is a changed NATO military strategy that was changed in 2019, understanding that Russia is a threat to the Allied security and Euro-Atlantic security, where the Latvian interest arises, how we evaluate the threat, what are our own resources, how do we work with the rest of the allies, how do we convince them about what we are seeing, what we think is the right way ahead to increase the deterrence and defense, and how you formulate and achieve that outcomes that you need together with other allies.
Is Latvia, which obviously is a small, vulnerable, very much frontline state, when you come...
that's not how we think about ourselves. We think we are very brave and strong external border holder of EU and NATO with countries that is defined as a threat.
I stand corrected, but nevertheless, when you come to a NATO summit, are you coming substantially seeking reassurance that support from the alliance remains constant?
No, because, again, we have worked diligently towards certain outcomes. So basically, for example, on the deterrence and defense package, they had already been agreed before the summit, but allied leaders need to confirm that. But then, of course, support Ukraine. Situation on the battlefield is constantly changing. So what is that we as allies making sure that Ukraine is able to continue fighting its war of liberation, so that it has capability to do that and that it has moral support, so the will to do that. What do we as allies need to do to ensure that? Because as long as Ukraine is able to fight and hopefully win, we are much more secure.
But there's this idea that perhaps some countries further west are actually kind of frightened of the idea of a Russian defeat and having to deal with the consequences of that.
I haven't felt that anywhere. No, I don't think so. The clear understanding is that the problem is Russia. Russia is not going to go away. The policy is war. So we have to make sure that we are secure as allies, that we are prepared, and in the same time clearly providing what is needed for Ukraine, because Russia has invaded Ukraine. It's an aggressive war. Russia is oriented towards war. Currently doesn't have either capabilities or ability to attack NATO. However, if we don't degrade Russian capabilities in Ukraine, if we don't degrade Russia's ability to fight wars, Maybe in few years they have reconstituted and then they are at NATO borders. So we don't want war. NATO doesn't want war. NATO is a defensive alliance. So very clearly helping Ukraine to win, but to win they need to have what they need to fight, is a priority.
Latvian Foreign Minister Baiba Brace. And finally for this segment, we will hear from one country currently prevented from aspiring to NATO membership by its own commitment to neutrality, but nonetheless invited to join the anniversary shindig. Mihai Popsoy is Moldova's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. I began by asking him what the value is of attending this summit as a non-member.
Our biggest hope is that this summit and later on Ukraine will continue to receive significant support, because Ukraine is not only defending itself, it's also defending the Republic of Moldova. And the political stability and the pro-European outlook of the Republic of Moldova rests to a significant degree on the developments on the front line in Ukraine. Moldova now has clearly anchored itself onto the European Union, onto the free world. But as long as the threat of the Russian aggression remains to Ukraine and also to the Republic of Moldova, because the Russians have not shied away from making their intentions known that they would also take over Moldova if they could. Thank God they cannot. And it is thanks to the sacrifice of the Ukrainian armed men and women, the courage and the determination, that Moldova is at peace. And our hope from this summit is that Ukraine will receive the support that it needs. And we're encouraged by the messages from President Biden that the Euro-Atlantic community will continue to stand by Ukraine. And that is a reassuring message for us in Moldova, who are directly affected by this Russian aggression.
But are you also here, though, to make sure that people don't forget that Moldova's there? I mean, I know you said that Ukraine is fighting for Moldova's security as well, but are you satisfied that if Ukraine is safe, then Moldova is also safe? Or do you worry that Moldova could be a target and people have sort of forgotten that?
No, you're totally right. Moldova has been and remains a target for the Russians, not just in the military sense, but primarily in the hybrid tactics, attempting to destabilize the Republic of Moldova through cyber attacks, through paying protesters in Moldova to rattle the government.
And kind of continuing to occupy quite a large chunk of your territory as well.
Yes, the Transnistrian region of the Republic of Moldova is an important element, although the Russians have been unable to instrumentalize, thank God, the Transnistrian region in further escalatory measures, because we're in constant talks with folks on the left bank in the Transnistrian region to maintain peace and stability. We have absolutely no interest in destabilizing the situation, especially that Moldova is now firmly anchored onto the European path and has these important opportunities coming up with the EU accession negotiations. This is a strong pull factor for the Transnistrian region, and we're determined to use all the avenues for a peaceful reintegration. And of course, the Russians on the other side are trying to use any avenue they can to destabilize us, to derail us from our European path. But we are confident that our citizens will know to make the difference. All our citizens, including those that live in the Transnistrian region, having seen what the Russian world has to offer in the front line in Ukraine, you'll be hard-pressed to be a big promoter of the so-called Russian world.
Well, I mean, that does prompt what I guess is a somewhat NATO-related question, which is that one about, I think it's Article 11 of your constitution that guarantees Moldova's neutrality. And I understand that changing that would, of course, be a matter for the Moldovan people. But what's your view on it? Do you think that is sustainable, given where Moldova is in the world?
Well, on a personal level, of course, you don't have to have a PhD in security studies to understand that NATO is the ultimate guarantee of security, not just in our region, but throughout the Euro-Atlantic community. Unfortunately, in the Republic of Moldova, the Russians have been effective in exploiting this Soviet and post-Soviet perception of NATO, and they have fed this negative perception of NATO in Moldova, while at the same time feeding this a notion of neutrality as a guarantee of security, which the Russians have been adamant about, ironically while being the only ones constantly violating Moldova's neutrality for the past 32 years now, maintaining troops and munitions in the Transnistrian region despite the express will of the successive Moldovan governments and Moldovan people for the Russians to withdraw. But the fact remains that absolute majority of the Moldovan citizens still see value in neutrality. It is largely a testament to the failure of the political class to be able to find ways to explain to our citizens what the risks are in our region and what the costs are. But that is a work in progress. That is something that we have to do within the democratic process to build the support for NATO membership. And in time, people will have to make up their mind within the legitimacy of democratic process.
That was Mihai Popsoi, Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Moldova. You're listening to the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. This is the Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. American voters, whether they entirely realise it or not, may end up deciding this November whether or not the US remains NATO's crucial pillar. For a look at how that might affect America's place in the world more broadly, we'll hear finally from Ian Brzezinski, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO policy.
I'd be hoping to see a clear strategy that NATO would enunciate and then implement to enable Ukraine to win this war decisively, quickly, and on its terms. That strategy just hasn't been there. And it's a strategy that can be feasible. It would have 5 elements. It would be 1, complete embrace and endorsement of Ukraine's war objectives, which is total territorial reconstitution.
This is all of its 1991 territory, including Donbass and Crimea.
Donbass and such. Anything short of that is disillusioning to the Ukrainians. Anything short of that is basically a green light. It's encouragement to Putin to sustain his brutal hegemonic ambitions against Ukraine's efforts to suborn Ukraine. The second key element would be weapons, weapons, weapons. At the rate they need it, with the capability they need, and without the restrictions that we've been imposing, the caveats that prevent them from hitting all legitimate targets, military targets in Russia. Third element is real economic sanctions with aggressive enforcement. And the fact that Russia's economy grew by 3% last year shows the inadequacy of the sanctions regime and its enforcement. Sanctions aren't the end-all to everything, but it is a demonstration of political will, and it would complicate Russia's war machine, maybe even grind it down to a slower pace, if not a stop. The fourth element would be a clear effort to communicate to the Russian people to turn them away from this war. Here we are in election season in the United States, election season in Europe, and Russia has an all-out disinformation onslaught on our societies and our polities. How are we responding? We should be weaponizing the truth against Putin's war, informing the Russian people of the sacrifices he's imposing on them. And then finally, there should be a clear path for Ukraine to NATO membership. NATO membership has to be part of the win strategy, just not as part of a strategy to secure whatever peace whenever it comes. NATO membership and the security guarantee that comes with it, the Article 5 clause that comes with it, is the only thing Putin respects. It's the only way to convince him that Ukraine is no longer in a gray zone, vulnerable to his hegemony, to his imperial ambitions. So those are the 5 elements of a strategy that I would hope NATO would enunciate and implement.
There's a few things there I want to pick up on in due course, but first to the point about weapons and restrictions on weapons. And this is a pattern that, as you know, has repeated over the last 2 years, and a bit of this. It's all been this kind of anguished incrementalism. Should we send them tanks? Should we send them long-range missiles? Should we send them fighter planes? We tend to get there eventually, but it's an agonizing question. But if we go back 2 years and a bit and had just given Ukraine everything that could have been given to them, do you think this war could have been won already?
I think so. Put it this way, we could have deterred this war, or the second phase of this war, from happening if we had responded more forcefully to the buildup of Russian forces in the fall of 2021 and initial month of 2022. We didn't. We didn't even impose economic sanctions. So our lack of response to Russia's buildup, which was long-term, it was clear, it was massive, it was overt, basically signaled to Putin that we weren't ready to take real action, not to mention when we fled the country in the weeks before the invasion. All right, mistakes were made. You couldn't deter it. The invasion happened. We could have searched far more assistance to the Ukrainians far faster when we realized the Ukrainians were actually capable of holding back the Russian invasion. We didn't. We let our fears of escalation impede our ability, our willingness to flow that kind of equipment into Ukraine. Look how effectively the Ukrainians have operated, not only just their courage and their tenacity, but their effectiveness. They took back 50% of the territory that Russia seized from it. They've imposed some 500,000 casualties on the Russian military. They've basically shooed the Russian fleet to the eastern part of the Black Sea. They've shown tremendous capability. They just haven't had the mass and the tools necessary to really push the Russians all the way out.
This is something that various Ukrainians have said to me, certainly, and to other people over the last couple of years. There's a part of Western thinking that actually fears the consequences of Russia being defeated. Do you think that is a factor in what is causing people still to hesitate in supporting Ukraine to the hilt?
You know, alliance strategy, Washington's strategy when it comes down to supporting Ukraine doesn't have Ukrainian victory as a top order priority. The top order priority is escalation control, conflict management, and that has impaired our ability, our willingness to provide Ukraine the tools that it needs. I mean, we should be crushing Russia in this war. Think about the geoeconomic, geopolitical, the military imbalance between the alliance and Russia. You know, the 32 allies are convening here in Washington today. They represent $54 trillion in GDP. That's more than 25 times Russia's GDP, which is less than $2 trillion. NATO allies are estimated to spend $1.4 trillion on defense this year. That's against Russia's defense budget, which is estimated between $100 billion and $120 billion. You know, there's a 10-time gap between the two. And then, of course, you look at the military capabilities. No one doubts that allied forces are better trained, better equipped, and have better morale than their Russian counterparts. So as we sit and watch this summit take place here in Washington, this imbalance of power begs the question, why isn't NATO decisively enabling Ukraine to push the Russians out of its territory? It's a matter of political will.
But as someone yourself who's been professionally thinking about Russia and the management of it for decades, as indeed your father did before you, do you have no fear yourself of what an actual Russian defeat might entail? Because you can see the argument that this is a whole other can of worms. You know, at worst, think of, 30 Yugoslavias with rogue nuclear weapons.
You know, let me put it this way, because we're talking about NATO's 75th anniversary. What made the alliance so successful over the last 75 years was a combination of well-trained, well-equipped military formations, a defense posture that was robust, and political fortitude, resolve, resoluteness. That's what enabled the alliance to defend West Berlin, the tiny little outpost in East Germany that was surrounded, heavily surrounded by Soviet forces. The Russians, the Soviets then knew that if they touched that little enclave, there would be war, that we would fight. I'm not so sure we're creating that same perception today in the way we're supporting Ukraine, because we've allowed Putin to deter us, enabling him to exercise nuclear coercion effectively, and that's a problem.
But do you not think there would be not a worse or bigger security issue for Western Europe in particular, but certainly a different one if in the event of defeat? And if you look at, previous catastrophic Russian military defeats, the last one led to a fairly large-scale revolution, which caused several decades of headaches for the West itself. I mean, do you think that prospect is putting people off equipping and training and helping Ukraine as much as they might?
My sense is that the dangers of a Russian loss are far outweighed by the perpetuation of this war or a Russian victory. You know, if this war is perpetuated, the likelihood of Ukraine failing increases. This is an imbalance between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Russians have a bigger population, bigger economy, bigger military industrial complex, et cetera, et cetera. Ukrainians are small. Ukrainians have already probably lost 200,000, 300,000 people or wounded and killed in battle. We've got a quarter of the population displaced. Millions have fled their country. Half their energy grid is down. Putin's chopping away at their hospitals, as we saw just earlier this week. Time is not on Ukraine's side. And if Ukraine loses, we're probably going to see further aggression, wider aggression in Europe, and it will probably encourage aggression by other hegemons elsewhere around the world. So the risks associated with a Russian defeat are far outweighed by the risks that come with the perpetuation of this war or a Russian victory.
And looking at this from the perspective of the country we're sitting in and its capital in particular, do you get the sense, as I think a lot of Ukrainians do, that there could be a clock ticking on this? Because obviously if there is a change of administration in this country in November and a new president or a former president sworn back in January, that you can kind of see there the nightmare scenario of Putin thinking, well, let's try a chunk of NATO territory and see how serious Article 5 really is.
Well, this is one of the dangerous elements of President Trump's platform. He's going out and his advisors are basically signaling they want to force Ukraine into a ceasefire, which is basically a de facto ceding of territory. That in no way helps the Ukrainians, and it's a kind of, again, a green light to Putin to continue his military invasion.
So do you think it's important, therefore, that Ukraine not only win this, but win it fast?
I think you were asking, how do you inoculate the Western effort against the potential downsides of a Trump administration? The way you do that is you put Ukraine on a winning path. Because I have a feeling that if Ukraine is winning, let me put it this way, if Ukraine is losing, or if this summit doesn't yield kind of a clear path to Ukrainian victory, it'll probably reinforce President Trump's disdain for Ukraine. It'll probably reinforce his perceptions of the Europeans as kind of feckless and weak, unwilling to kind of stand up for their own defense, their own backyard. It'll further reinforce his negative perceptions of NATO. But if Ukraine is put on a clear path to victory, Trump is the kind of guy who likes to hang out with winners. He'll probably want to take credit for. He'll say this shows NATO stronger because he made NATO stronger, and he want to be with the winning side. So if you want to inoculate the West's effort to support Ukraine against some of the darker potentials of a second Trump administration, you leverage the economic, you leverage the military, you leverage the diplomatic power the West has to put Ukraine onto path. We have the resources.
It does seem in the current circumstances just finally like a fairly fatuous, idle question possibly, but can you imagine a time and circumstances in which relations between the West and Russia are not necessarily antagonistic? I mean, you will of course be able to remember that slightly wild period in the late 90s, early 2000s when, I mean, there was even talk of Russia joining NATO in some circles.
Yeah, I could foresee it. It's something we should aspire to. And it wasn't a mistake to try to foster that kind of relationship back in the 1990s. But unfortunately, under the current regime, I don't see that happening. And what I'm worried about is that Putin is not only has his own personal ambitions that he's pursuing, he's been transforming much of Russia's younger generation in his own image and in his own mindset, which makes me more pessimistic about the potentials of such a more positive relationship.
That was Ian Brzezinski at the Atlantic Council. That's it for this special episode of The Foreign Desk, recorded at the 2024 NATO Summit in Washington, D.C. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Christy O'Grady. Christy also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Chris at cc@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.